This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. Okay, so welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Tim Knotts, and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. Today is Wednesday, March 13th, 2024. Happy upcoming St. Patrick's Day as well as Easter. He is risen. I'm Lee Bortons, and I'm just so grateful to be able to share this time with my colleagues. And we want to welcome a very special guest, Stephanie Meter, who just loves books like we do. So thanks, team, for being here. Jennifer, what's going on today? This month, actually.
Yeah, so all month we're discussing things that would help families who are in essentials or families who want to know more about grammar and writing and spelling and those kinds of skills. So we are looking at IEW's Teaching Writing Structure and Style. I have to say that one slowly. And we are looking at the Center for Lit's Teaching the Classics. That'll be today's episode. We're looking at Spelling Plus, and then finally the Trivium Tables whiteboard. We might play some games that day.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. And for folks who aren't familiar, when we just say essential, like everybody knows what it means, the Essentials of Language is one of our community programs where families with children that are about 8 to 12-year-old range just work on what is essential in language. What are the rules that you follow in order to correct grammatically any kind of sentence? So you can find interesting information about that and other things on our my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, or you can go to my website leebortons.com and click on the archive to see past events and also the calendar to see upcoming books. And the calendar always has links to the books that we are reading so that you can purchase them if you would like. So thanks for being here with us. Okay, so Jennifer, let's get started.
Great. So I'm excited to talk about teaching the classics today. I said it was brought to us by the Center for Lit. And the Center for Lit is really a homeschooling family, Adam and Missy Andrews, and they're a longtime homeschooling family. And so we have enjoyed knowing them and watching their family grow in their homeschool. And we're excited also to use this resource, Teaching the Classics, that they've produced. So Lee, why is this one of the resources that you recommend for parents?
Well, I could give you the facetious answer. Back when I first started homeschooling classically, I was friends with Andrew Kern, Andrew Pudowa, and Adam Andrews. And so you could say that's the reason. It's got an Andrew in the name. But what happened is the Lord just brought together a team of young parents at that time, really interested in helping parents with young children be ready for those more prolific assignments that are due in the high school and college years. And so the relationship with Adam and Missy, like you said, has only been a positive, and we continue to value all that they do to help people teach the classics with their particular emphasis on new parents and younger children. So that's why it's in the curriculum. They know what they're doing, and it's just a really simple curriculum to use with lots of ideas. And one of the things that's changed, I'm sure we'll talk about more, is when we first started homeschooling in the 70s and 80s, homeschoolers just assumed people knew how to read books and talk about them because we really were still a literature culture. But with the rise of 24/7 TV as well as the internet, that's changed. And so more parents may need some help just kind of entering into some of the simpler books that we recommend as classics.
Yeah, and I wanted you to go over again. Last week, we talked about a grandma resource when we talked about how IEW teaches 9 units of writing, and that would equip you as the parent to teach your kids of all ages how to write. So talk about this one as a grandma book too. And what do you mean by that term, grandma book?
Yeah, you're so good to remind me that, and here I am a grandma, and I forget to use the word, but I used to call this as the kids were growing up and I was homeschooling them the grandma book because it's where I went to get wisdom. It was a book that I would use to train myself, so no matter what kind of situation I encountered with my children in the realm of language, I had an idea in the back of my head on how to be serendipitous or embrace that teachable moment or help them with, just enter into conversations they were struggling with. And so it's not a book designed to turn pages and do this on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's a book really to just help you see a big picture of how you could teach the classics.
I love that. Equipping ourselves. Nice.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of what we do in CC is helping parents to put on their own oxygen mask first. And that's why, we always say we're about a classical Christian community and the parents are our community. Their children are their community.
Yeah. And we also talk a lot about restoring the education of two generations at once. So we are reclaiming some things in our own educations, either that we never learned or that we need to remember.
Mhm.
And then we're doing it with our kids at the same time. So nice. All right. I think you're up with our next question.
Am I?
Yeah, it's you.
It's me? Oh, I was skipping right down to Stephanie's question. So last year we had a discussion of the definition of a story. You and I have argued repeatedly over what the definition of a story is. You get to win because I think you're more precise, and yet it'd be good to have that conversation where others can hear us too, so that we can maybe help folks wrestling with, well, what makes something a story versus the other forms of writing. So can you go ahead and, give us your take, Jennifer, on really what is a story?
Yeah. So it was kind of a funny conversation we had last year, and then we just happened to be talking to Adam at the same time.
That's
But
right.
unfortunately, our conversation with Adam didn't get recorded due to technical difficulties. But basically, we were wrangling over whether when you come in and list off all the things you did in a day, or you do a lab report, or in other words, is any kind of written expression a story? And so I may have gotten a little carried away in our discussion, but I was arguing for the fact that it has to be about a person who is trying to achieve a goal or who has desires and the obstacles that they face getting to those desires. And so if I just told you about my trip to the grocery store and all I did was list off all the things I bought, that wouldn't really be a story. But if I went because I was hosting a big party and I really needed a particular item and I went to 5 different stores and they didn't have it, and then I finally conquered that by borrowing it from a friend, you're getting closer to a story because I would have my desire that I'm trying to meet and all the ways it was frustrated and then the way that that frustration was finally overcome.
So you just helped me after a year of wrangling understand what you've been saying. Funny how many times I've had this conversation with you. Yeah, so basically you're saying the difference is you can rattle off a list and even say it in an interesting way, but if it doesn't have the parts of a story, it's failed to meet that standard.
I think so. Yeah. Stephanie, do you have anything you want to add to that mix? I know you think about this a lot too.
Yes, no, I agree with you. And I think for me, the thing that would turn it from a list into a story is the conflict. At first, my gut was to say that it's the characters that turn it into that. But I think you also have to have a conflict or a goal of some kind. Even if it's the easiest story in the world and you don't run into a lot of obstacles, if you have a goal, at least that sort of anchors it in being a story to me.
Yeah, I just thought of another example that might help us. If I were doing an experiment in chemistry and absolutely everything fell apart, all the equipment broke, and I just had a frustrating day in the lab, I could turn that into a story, but it really wouldn't be my lab report. In the end, I would still solve those problems, do the experiment, and record only the parts of a lab report in my lab report. So I could write a really funny story about a bad day in the lab, but it wouldn't be the same thing as the lab report itself.
So are we going to spend different time talking over those other types of writing, or should we address then what you would call the list or the lab report? Is there an umbrella title for them since you don't want to call them stories?
So I think that actually going back to last week and the IEW teaching, writing, structure, and style might be a good starting place. So there are factual types of, like, let's say a history report. So last week we outlined one of the history cards. And if we had finished it, we would have turned it into paragraphs about the ancient civilizations that were formed near rivers. That is a factual report. So I think that IW has those few units that are basically what we used to grow up calling reports, factual accounts. And then they have their narrative unit where they want children to experience stories and then write a story. And so they have that narrative unit built in, but along the way, they have lots of essays and reports, and then things like critiques where you look at someone else's story or book and you evaluate that book. And so that becomes the critique. So really all those units that are in the teaching, writing, structure, and style kind of cover the broad scope of things. They don't cover lab reports, but
So would that then distinguish the
person.
difference between a book report, which
Mhm.
young children and novice writers are generally pretty good at, versus a character sketch
Mhm.
where you more show through conflict and setting than tell?
Yes, good. Yeah. Showing versus telling is a good
Mhm.
way of expressing story
Well, it
too.
just took me 62 years.
Do you think
It's
it has to do with tension and release? Like in music, that's what gives music forward motion,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
And that seems to be true with stories too, right? That there's a conflict which builds tension until finally you get the release at the end of it. And that's what makes it pleasurable for us, is that the conflict either gets fully resolved or at least partly resolved, and we arrive back at some sort of a new place where the tension has been reduced.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy, Tim. And
There's some-
oh,
okay.
go, you go ahead, Lee.
Well, I was gonna, because there's some no, I've never read a book this way, but there's some movies that generally are British where it's almost like there's no ending. And I always wonder, well, so what was that story? It was just more of like a look into their life.
It's more like a character sketch than it is like a story, right?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
like
And
reading someone's diary.
there are
Right.
books and movies that are like that.
Mhm,
They're typically either not stories or they're bad stories,
mhm.
broken, because they don't have all the parts that you need to have a complete story.
And that's another good distinction between a story and just a narration of your day, is that idea of a diary.
Mm.
You know, in a diary, you're recording day by day what happens, but you're not stepping out of it usually and making meaning out of it. So an author takes a huge amount of possible experiences they could talk about and chooses to arrange them in this sort of plot pyramid that we're going to look at in a minute, where you do have that climax. So they wouldn't tell all, although some have accused my favorite author Dickens of trying to tell all the moments.
Mhm.
Generally, they pick and choose and they telescope to make meaning out of it.
Mhm.
So
I think that maybe is a signal of, again, 'cause some other conversations we've had. I'm trying to differentiate, how you know what you know and why did I miss it, and what can I do to help other young parents, be able to look at things the way Jennifer, Courtney, and Stephanie Meter do. And all the things you've said made me think about my father, who wrote a diary. And he really did have a conflict that came up that he resolved. That was the heart of it was over a 3-month period he kept this diary. And so he probably just had that more intuition because it was such a literate culture then, and a story culture, that even his diary sounded more like a novel. And I go back and I read some of the obituaries I have from great great grandparents hanging on my wall, and they're funny because they tell a story. Like, we just don't do that anymore, do we? Or less of it, I guess.
yeah, I think there is probably possibly less of it. And what you said to help families is true. One reason that Stephanie and I can do this with novels, and the reason Tim was able to do it so easily just now with music, is lots and lots of reading and lots of listening.
Hmm.
So you build that knowledge over time.
I think people mistake reading, like when we were growing up, they had this subject called reading comprehension, which like felt dumb to to readers of that generation, because you weren't reading if you didn't comprehend it. Yet
Right.
we really have fragmented that too, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think something else you pointed out just a few minutes ago, Lee, is we watch a lot of movies now, and that's a very passive form of encountering a story. Whereas when you read it, you're
Mhm.
much more aware of what's going on, and those story forms become more obvious to you. And even more than that is actual storytelling. Like if you go and listen to someone who's a really good storyteller, it's engaging and engrossing, and you want to do that. You want to be that kind of a person after you've encountered that.
Mhm.
Uh, and and we've lost a lot of that.
Mhm.
We don't have those kinds of opportunities very much, and even when we have them, we frequently don't take advantage to go and listen to someone tell a good story.
Mhm. You know, it's quite an honoring thing, but I remember when because we had that age gap with our 4 children, and I can remember Robert repeatedly telling the babies, "Be quiet, mom's telling a story." And it's really been a blessing to me because his wife April has said to to their children now a couple times, come here, grandma's telling a story," right? Or Nana is. So, and my mom told stories, and my great grandmother and grandmother both told stories. So it's in my blood, but what's the differences between me and you guys, I think, is that you spent the time studying it more academically than I did.
Mhm.
So you see those nuances that I maybe have internalized, but don't have the words to express.
Yeah, that's good. And what we're doing in our education, and that's partly we're getting ready to demonstrate it when Stephanie walks us through
Mhm.
Freytag's pyramid is as you do have all those things that you know, but you don't have words for. And that's a part of what we're trying to say in classical education is we're gonna over time give you the better and better words to go with all those ideas that you're having.
Mhm.
And that will help you be more attentive too. So
Good.
well, that's a good segue. So, Stephanie, you want to talk us through Freytag's pyramid? I'm going to see if I can
Sure.
share the screen. Let's see if I've got it here. Oh. It will help if I click the right button. All right, here we go. You guys see the pyramid?
Mhm.
All right.
Okay, so this is Freytag's pyramid, and it's a chart to help understand stories. And really, usually when we're reading a story, that right-hand side is a little bit shorter, but we're just keeping it neat and symmetrical, just visually. So, but a story will usually start off with the exposition phase, and that's where you get to know the characters and the setting. And pretty soon in that setting up part of the story, you'll get a conflict. And it's usually a question of, will the character be able to do something? And then the story continues with the character trying to achieve his or her goal, and that's the rising action. Things are happening. There's developments. There's usually some kind of a hang up about halfway through. You know, maybe the first plan fails to succeed, or the friends have an argument, or there's something that happens in that rising action where you're afraid the character's not going to achieve her goal. But then the climax happens, and the story question that will the character be able to achieve her goal is answered. So it's usually yes. Sometimes it's no, but usually yes. The answer in the climax is the character is able to achieve her goal. And then you have the falling action, which is everything that happens after that climax has been resolved. So this is usually some conversations between characters. Sometimes we touch on the theme a little bit in that falling action. And it's all building towards that resolution or the denouement, which means the unknotting. Denouement means unknotting. So just untangling those last little threads, or weaving them together. You know, we don't like loose ends. And then you'll see at the bottom of the pyramid, we have theme. You can kind of see that poking out, but it's kind of under the whole thing. It's that circle that is part of the whole story. So it's usually a question that the author is getting the reader to ask. We have themes that are like forgiveness or redemption or revenge or love, something that is woven throughout the story that the events of the story will help you as the reader to think about.
So I was thinking about how, like, when you read To Kill a Mockingbird or even Where the Crawdads Sing, that resolution and denouement are unsettling. And one of the reasons you read the book over and over again, because the author leaves you a little bit unsure of exactly what happened.
Mhm.
Is, is that a good story or a bad story?
So I think it can be. Interestingly, Mia decided to write her To Kill a Mockingbird essay this year about about the fact that Atticus Finch knows that he cannot solve the problems of racial injustice in his community. So he already knows that there will be no attractive denouement to this story. They're not going to fix these problems of Tom Robinson being falsely accused, of all those things that are going on in their Southern community. But someone has to start the ball rolling toward justice. And so for the sake of his kids and for the sake of his community and for the sake of his integrity, he does it anyway. And so I think it's still a good story. It's just not, we just don't get to see the end. The end came probably even past Atticus's lifetime. So
I think the stories that we give our little kids most of the time have a complete resolution, right? The family circle is restored, the good guys win, the bad guys lose, right? It's a pretty complete resolution in the whole sense. But as we get older, our stories reflect more and more real life, where we have a partial resolution or we have a partial release of tension and conflict. And it still follows this pattern. It just maybe doesn't have, again, like Stephanie said, it doesn't peak neatly in the middle, nor does it necessarily reach all the way back down to flat ground. It may stop somewhere partway down, but it still has that motion to it that makes it feel like a story that went somewhere.
When I was younger, I really hated stories that didn't have a clear denouement. That was a huge pet peeve of mine. I tended to feel like they weren't good stories. And then as I've gotten older, I still think some of them are poor stories, but I think if the author does it well, then it can work. And I'm trying to figure out what I mean by doing it well, because that's not a great sentence if I can't define doing it well. I do think that conversation around stories is really important. And so even if you have an ending that is unsatisfying to some people, there's an opportunity to talk about what you think did happen or what you think was missing. So that can be valuable. I also think it makes a difference if the author did it on purpose or not. Sometimes the author of poor stories will just not understand that they've left something unsaid, or they really did just have loose ends, and that's a problem of the craft.
yeah, I was thinking about what you said. I think is absolutely right, Stephanie, that when we're younger, we need things to be tied up neatly. I mean, it's no accident that all the fairy tales end and they lived happily ever after. Everything is tied up in a neat package. And then as we grow up and get more mature, we realize life is more complex. And so those endings are more open. But you're also right to say that not every story that has an unsatisfying ending is good. Some people do that really well. I think it's hard to put a finger on. And
I'm wondering about Tim and music, if you could give us an example, because some music doesn't end with like, it could end with dissonance, or just somehow it doesn't feel like it got finished.
Yeah, it's funny. Just a few weeks ago in our church, we sang a song, a contemporary song that has some really lovely lyrics. But it ends on a chord that doesn't resolve. It doesn't come back to that home feeling that most music does, right? Most of our stuff comes back to a lovely 1-5 chord that makes you feel inside like, we've arrived back where right, back at this happy landing spot. And this one doesn't. And because of that, it's a very odd song to fit into the flow of a worship service. If it doesn't flow directly into another song, it feels unresolved. It leaves people feeling like, wait, was that it? Was that the end of the song? What do we do now? And so most of our music follows this same kind of feeling. It builds and builds to a climax and then resolves, or sometimes the climax is the resolution in music, right? Sometimes it builds to this great crescendo and ends at the climax, which is a different kind of resolution. But yeah, but there's plenty of music that doesn't end that way, and it does leave us feeling unsatisfied in certain ways. And sometimes the artist will do that on purpose. Will leave us with a lack of resolution to make us feel that way.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, is that maybe I don't study music the same way at all, but I wondered if maybe thematically that was a choice. Like the composer wants you to feel like it's not finished. And then that made me think about books again, whereas maybe one of the things that makes an unclear ending good is when you as the reader are left with that idea that it's not finished, kind of like To Kill a Mockingbird. It's not resolved, which is telling us that yes, we can continue the story. The story is trying to get you to continue on this theme as best as you can.
Yeah, and that may clear up your definition of it being well done and not well done too, is that when the author is aware and it is intentionally doing that to further the theme or to be historically true or true to the story, and they're doing that with skill versus the inexperienced author who leaves it hanging because they don't know. They didn't finish it on purpose. The same thing I think would be true of a composer. If you're doing it on purpose, it's different from when you just don't know better.
Yeah, it's like those songs that just fade out, like they hit the bridge or the chorus and they go around and around and then it never lands. They just fade it out until it disappears. And it's like that's just badly done. That's like, I don't know how to end this thing, so I'm just gonna walk out of the room slowly and no one will notice. And some authors sort of do that sort of thing too. They just don't know how to land the story, and that's the sort of end of the lack of denouement that makes you upset, or maybe throw the book across the room or tell people don't read that book, I hate the ending. Not because something bad happened in the ending, it was just badly written at the ending.
Yeah, that's good.
I get tainted by a lot of very popular movies when the last 60 seconds is just dumb.
Yeah.
And I just will not promote that movie and tell people to go see it, even
Yeah.
though the other 121 minutes was wonderful.
That ending really matters though.
It does. So,
So
so it's getting that time to move on to actually what we're here for today, but thank you for this conversation. Because I don't think it applies just to us and how we look at stories, but our challenge students may have a lot of these same kind of questions. So even though we're going to be talking about children's literature for the rest of this episode, everything we're going to talk about applies for all ages and all times and all kinds of literature. So thanks for indulging me on that. But it is time to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where our books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to the CC book site, as well as links to YouTube so you can listen to previous episodes. And next week, we will be discussing Spelling Plus by Susan C. Anthony. Who knew you could spend 45 minutes with interesting people talking about spelling? Well, let's see if we do it or not next week.
that'll be our challenge, won't it? Well, normally at this point in the show, we would do a close reading of a passage if we were doing a novel. But because we've been focusing on things that train the parent to teach this month, there's not really a passage to look at. So instead, we're going to practice. So the Teaching the Classics is structured around the story elements that Stephanie just walked us through from Freytag's pyramid. So each of them are covered, and then there are questions for parents that help you discuss setting and character and plot and conflict, and even some authorly things like point of view. The Teaching the Classics works you progressively through those with simple text to harder text and gives the questions. So we're going to practice doing that right now. And so we're going to use a short story that is from Ancient World Echoes that comes to us from Tibet. I love that. Just saying that makes me happy that we have a Tibetan short story about the frog and the crow. And so I'm going to pull that up so that you can follow along with Tim as he reads it to us.
All right, here we go. This is The Frog and the Crow, retold by Sir William F.T. O'Connor. A crow once caught a fine, fat frog, and taking him in her bill, she flew with him to the roof of a neighboring house in order to devour him at her leisure. As she alighted on the roof of the house, the frog gave an audible chuckle. "What are you laughing at, brother frog?" said the crow. "Oh, nothing, Sister Crow," said the frog. "Never mind me. I was just thinking to myself that, as it fortunately happens, my father lives close by here, on this very roof. And as he is an exceedingly fierce, strong man, he will certainly avenge my death if anyone injures me." The crow did not quite like this, and thinking it as well to be on the safe side, she hopped off to another corner of the roof, near to where a gutter led away the rainwater by means of a small hole in the parapet and a wooden spout. She paused here for a moment, and was just about to begin to swallow the frog when the frog gave another chuckle. "What are you laughing at this time, Brother Frog?" asked the crow. "Oh, it's only a small matter, Sister Crow, hardly worth mentioning," replied the frog. "But it just occurred to me that my uncle, who is even a stronger and fiercer man than my father, lives in this very gutter, and that if anybody was to do me an injury here, they would have a very small chance of escaping from his clutches." Well, the crow was somewhat alarmed at hearing this, and she thought that on the whole it would be safer to leave the roof altogether. So, again picking up the frog in her bill, she flew off to the ground below and alighted near the edge of a well. Here
Mhm.
she placed the frog upon the ground and was just about to eat him when the frog said, "Oh, Sister Crow, I notice your bill seems rather blunt. Before you begin to eat me, don't you think it would be a good thing to sharpen it a little? You can sharp it very nicely on that flat stone over there." The crow, thinking this was a good idea, took 2 or 3 hops towards the stone and began sharpening her bill. As soon as she had turned her back, the frog gave one desperate jump and dived into the well. As soon as the crow had made her bill nice and sharp, she returned from the stone and looked about for the frog. Not finding him where she had left him, she hopped to the edge of the well and peeped over, craning her head from side to side. Presently she spied the frog in the water and called out to him, "Oh, Brother Frog, I was afraid you were lost. My bill is quite nice and sharp now, so come along up and be eaten." "I'm so sorry, Sister Crow," replied the frog, "but the fact is I cannot get up the sides of this well. The best thing would be for you to come down here to eat me." And so saying, he dived to the bottom of the well.
I love your voices. That was very nice. Thank you, Tim. All right. So I'm going to pull up our pyramid while we talk, since that's maybe a new tool to some. So Lee, what was the setting for this story? Tell us about that.
Well, so obviously it's outside, but near a home because it starts on the ground where the frog is, it moves to the roof, and it ends at a well. So there's 3 settings, but altogether it sounds rustic. It doesn't have to be, but it's what it sounds like.
Nice. Okay. So Stephanie, how about you introduce us to the characters?
Yeah, well, we've only got 2 characters, really. We have the crow and the frog. We do have mentions of the crow's father and uncle, but those 2 characters of the crow who's trying to eat the frog and the frog who's trying to get away, that's pretty much all we've got.
Do you find it interesting that the crow is a sister rather than a
I
masculine?
noticed that too on this reading for the first time. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I do like using stories like this or Aesop's fables to start with our kids, as this is because it does narrow the universe a little bit, because we do only have a couple of characters here and the setting might be pretty simple. But if you wanted to expand it with your kids, you could go on and on describing, how you imagine the setting. So Stephanie, going back to our definition that we got from Adam and Missy Andrews, that a story is a tale about a protagonist who has a desire or goal and then has to overcome obstacles. Who's the protagonist in this story and what do they want?
I love this question because my instinct is that the frog is the protagonist, but then I have to think about why, because both characters have a goal and both characters have obstacles every step of the way. I'm just thinking out loud. I think the frog comes out as the protagonist to me in this story, maybe because he wins, like he's successful. And a lot of times in our young stories or stories for young children, the protagonist does win. I mean, usually the protagonist wins in most stories. And also the frog is the one pushing the story forward and has agency, which is not necessarily a protagonist thing. Sometimes you are reacting to the antagonist. But the frog is the one controlling the action. He's the one telling the crow that, oh, well, if you stay here, my dad's going to come find you. And that prompts the crow to react. And then, oh, if you stay here, my uncle's going to find you. And oh, I can't climb up the well, or oh, your beak is not sharp enough. The frog is the one calling the shots really the whole time. And also just being eaten, like the predator seems like the bad guy.
Yeah, I think that's good. I really like your answer because I will tell you guys a story about my challenge for community yesterday. What started off as a very simple question on my part about Aeneas in the Aeneid and him being the protagonist and what did he want. And I was just trying to get them to kind of summarize the action because we had gotten through a few books and I needed them to remember some things, turned into a conversation about everything they had read this year, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, and them making a case for different people being the protagonist and turning the story over and looking at it from that angle. So they took the Odyssey and said, what if Odysseus is the protagonist? What if Penelope is the protagonist? What if Telemachus is the protagonist? What if one of the gods is the protagonist? And so we had these 4 scenarios on the board. I didn't plan this, by the way. It's a completely unplanned conversation, but it is fun to think about. So I appreciated that you stopped and thought about it here too, because it can be more complex.
Yes. Yeah. And in my quest to become a novelist, I've studied this a little bit. And one of the things that makes your side characters important is that you should be able to turn the story so that it could be about them as well. Everybody who's acting in your story should have his or her own goal as well, especially if you're going to be switching points of view. You have to be sure that everybody actually has a goal that they're trying to accomplish and is working through that. Everyone should be their fully formed character, even if they're not technically your protagonist. It just helps with development.
I know people who swear up and down that Sam is the protagonist of The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, there you go. And there's a whole genre of novels right now where they take one of the side characters and make them the protagonist. So there's Marilla of Green Gables and Marmee from Little Women. Like it's a whole thing right now. All right, so we'll go for the sake of your very persuasive arguments. We will say that because the frog is not the predator and because he's sort of driving the story, he gets to be the protagonist today.
Before you ask Tim a question, I have a question about using the word protagonist. So the whole time I was growing up, my mom would tell us to stop antagonizing one another, meaning stop being the one that's bothering the other one. But I can't for the life of me remember a parent ever using protagonist as a word to describe their children. Could we?
I think so.
But does anybody?
I don't think anyone does. I don't know why you couldn't.
Yeah.
Well, and antagonist requires that you be against something. I mean, that's the root, right? Protagonist, and that's a good argument for part of Stephanie's argument, right? Is that the frog is the one working for his freedom, and the crow is the one responding. I think that antagonist mode tends to be that way.
But do we ever look at like the coach of a sports team as the protagonist? He's the one that's making it all happen, and the story's really about him. I don't think we're very good at pulling it out into real life, that word.
Yes, but when you were talking, I was thinking about one of my holiday movies that I really enjoy, and one of the character says to the person who is the protagonist, but she doesn't know she is, he says, stop acting like a supporting actress. You need to be the leading lady in your own story. And I've always hung on to that one little line. Like that's a really important piece of advice for him to give her. So I think
when we say leading lady, we're really using a synonym.
Yep, I think so.
That's makes me think of Jennifer, your favorite author. I'm listening to David Copperfield right now, and the opening line of that is, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. Yes. So the way that Dickens is writing this sort of autobiographical story, right? It's written from the first person of of the protagonist, but even there, he's questioning whether
Mhm.
he's actually the protagonist or not of his story.
Yes,
So hero might be a synonym.
I think so. Yes. And
Then
Dickens
you
is
have
hardest to question it because his leading ladies usually take over. So David Copperfield might not turn out to be the main character of his own story.
Yeah, sometimes you can have anti-heroes be the main character though, which is kind of a whole complex thing of if your main character isn't a good person, is he still the hero or is he just the main character?
Yes, we had that discussion yesterday too, because they were trying to say that Dido could be considered an anti-hero in the Aeneid because the anti-hero usually is the person who throws in additional obstacles to the hero. And if you consider Aeneas to be the hero of that story and his quest to found the city of Rome, then she's throwing in that extra obstacle. So we had that. We then tried to go back and identify all the anti-heroes based on who we said the protagonist was.
But does that go back to Stephanie's original summary of, which of the two? Because if the crow's the one that's trying to kill something, if he's the murderer, and then can he even be a protagonist, or is he always an antagonist? Because his goal, even though it's for himself, he has one that he wants to, it's a negative goal.
Well,
It's
if you told it from the crow's perspective, you could say he's starving or she's starving and she
Mhm.
needs to eat.
Mhm.
And the frog keeps thwarting her. Maybe she has babies to take care of. I mean, she needs to eat. It's just part of the circle of life. And the frog is getting in her way and tricking her and lying to her.
Mhm. So her own babies are dying because he won't die.
Yes.
All right, sorry.
It's okay. You've now explained that whole genre too, where you have things like Wicked, where you tell the story of Oz from the Wicked Witch's
Mhm.
perspective, which gives you a different.
But you do, I mean, you have those conversations in Challenge 4 and elsewhere. Anytime you encounter the epics, of is Hector or Achilles the actual hero? Is Turnus or Aeneas more honorable in the battles, right? In Latium? There are real questions there, and depending on how you read the story and the characters, you can disagree over which one is in the right.
And we
Yes.
have this conversation too in Challenge B when we read Rikki Tikki Tavi,
Mm.
because the Cobra family is trying to protect their babies ultimately. Like they are very aggressive, but it's the nature of a cobra to bite humans and protect their babies, and it's the nature of a mongoose to attack them. And so we read it and we think of Rikki Tikki Tavi, the mongoose, as being the hero, but I usually like to throw it out there to the kids. What if this was told from the snake's perspective? Like, did they do anything wrong? And that's kind of fun too.
Oh, that's fun. That's a really good example, Stephanie. I love that.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think all of these things are fine when we're discussing the story with our families. We might just have our kids might just right off the bat say, nope, the frog is the hero. And then you're going to always get that kid who loves to look at it from the other side. And as long as they can support what they're saying, it makes for a fantastic discussion. I don't think there has to be I would never close down that kind of discussion. I would welcome it.
Well, I think that's a good thing about Adam and Missy's book is there's just hundreds literally of questions so that you can see things from all kinds of perspectives.
Yeah. So we have to close pretty quickly. So Tim, do you want to tell us what if we take Stephanie's answer about the frog being the protagonist, what's the climax?
The frog gets what he wants. He escapes and jumps down into the well.
All right. Yep. He gets escaped. That was his goal. And then what lesson do we learn from the story, or what might be a quick theme that we could, there are lots of themes, but let's just pick one. Do you want to go for it, Stephanie?
Quick, I don't know. I was thinking about this. Honestly, one of the things that came to my mind is the danger of being distracted. Like you really need to keep your eye on what you're trying to do and not let yourself be led astray. Yeah.
That's a good one. I think that's an excellent one. We'd probably, if we had 15 more minutes, we'd probably come up with 15 more.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that was
What would
great.
you say the theme is, Jennifer?
Yeah, I was thinking, I don't know.
Because it's not friendship. It's like perseverance, or it reminds me in some ways of the Pit and the Pendulum, where at the last second the guy lives and
Yeah.
isn't killed because he waits and then he died. And then he just, I know, it's seizing your moment.
Yeah, I was thinking of it very conventionally because there's a lot of these kinds of stories, and I read a lot of them when I was making those books. And so there's that theme of, saving yourself by your wits.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That was kind of where my brain went.
the trickster stories,
Mhm.
right? They're from everywhere. All cultures have them.
Yes.
Sometimes the trickster is the bad guy.
Yes.
Sometimes the trickster is the good guy. Which is interesting.
And sometimes when you have someone like Loki, it's confusing.
Mm.
Okay, well, thank you that you are never confusing and that you clear me up, and hopefully our listeners too, on what makes a story. So thanks you I thought that was really great conversation, and I look forward to next week while we have just as much excitement over spelling. See you guys.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.